Planes, trains, and automobiles. They're designed to get us from place to place, but they come with a shelf life. Every vehicle ever built will eventually either break down irreparably or be replaced by a newer model. That leaves them nowhere to go but the scrap heap, and yet some of them escape that fate. Join us for this tour of curious and fascinating old machines and vehicles that no longer have a purpose, but still exist as monuments to a bygone age. Travel to the rural outskirts of the Shamrockaway in Russia, and you'll find a railway cemetery that's been standing for the better part of a century. None of these old engines will ever run again. Even the youngest of them has been gathering rust and weeds since 1956. The earliest comes from 20 years before that. During the Soviet years of the mid-20th century, this was a backup railway base that would have sprung into action in the event of nuclear war breaking out. But thankfully, that day never came, and the old equipment was never required. Most of the 140 trains that stand here run on steam and would have been considered almost obsolete even at the time they were parked and abandoned. Several attempts to buy them for scrap have been made over the years, but Grigory Gordiev, who owns the site, has resisted every offer. He'd rather see his unusual exhibits turned into a railway museum, and he's eager to hear from anyone who might help him fund that project. Considering the fact that the Spirit of Sacramento is supposed to be a riverboat, it ended up in a very strange location. It's been left by a roadside, and it's falling to pieces. That's a far cry from its heyday when it was owned by Hollywood legend John Wayne and even appeared in one of his movies. It started life as a snag boat in 1942, but was bought by John Wayne in 1954 when it was known as the Puta. Wayne used it in his 1955 movie Blood Alley, but later sold it to someone who wanted to use it to provide river tours to passengers. It was still afloat in the early 1990s, by which time it had found its way to Sacramento and offered luxury river cruises with dining facilities. Unfortunately, a fire broke out aboard the boat at the end of the decade and damaged it badly. That left it half sunk in the river, and although locals pulled it out and set it down on the land, it proved to be beyond repair and has since become a target for graffiti and vandalism. Here's another former luxury ship that's long past its days of glory. It's the MV Kalikala, launched in 1935 as a first-class ferry and enjoying a long and happy life for the next 30 years until it ended up in Seattle. For a time, it was one of the city's best-known tourist attractions, not least because of her beautiful Art Deco design. That came from Louis Proctor, who found fame designing planes for Boeing, but also clearly had a flair for waterborne vehicles. He even included space for a dance hall, with a stage large enough to host a full-size orchestra. Unfortunately, what she had in good looks, she lacked in practicality. The engines were badly aligned and constant vibrations damaged her body, requiring regular repairs and maintenance. By the 1970s, her owners had tired of paying for those repairs, so she was deliberately beached in 1970 to start a new life as a shrimp processing unit. That business didn't last for long, so the once proud MV Kalikala quickly became derelict. We're not able to provide you with the location of this tank cemetery other than to say it's somewhere in Europe, and it's still considered an active site even though the tanks here obviously haven't seen service or action in decades. It looks like they were lined up for a military parade that never happened, and nobody ever bothered to come back for them. Based on their design, most of them came from the 1970s and 1980s, but that doesn't mean they ought to be obsolete. Many of the active tanks in service around the world are 40 years old. In some cases, they're even older. There's a disused railway line visible in photographs next to the tanks, so that might tell us how they all came to be here, but not why they're still here now. One possibility is that they're former Red Army stock that was inherited by a former Soviet state after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but subsequently abandoned because the new state lacked the funds to maintain them. We all know what American school buses look like. They're large, yellow vehicles that take millions of American children to and from school every day. They can run for decades, but eventually they either break down or get replaced and end up in places like this graveyard-cum-art exhibition in Alto, Georgia. The graffiti artists who work on this site acquire the unwanted school buses at low prices, then tow them into the middle of this field, where they use them as steel canvases for their work. Alonzo Wade, who owns the land the buses stand on, also owns an auto parts shop in the area and originally wanted to use the old buses as a fence to keep thieves out of his property. Over time, he recognized their potential as an art installation, and he now allows a local creative group known as Crispy Prince to paint his bus collection whenever they like. Most of them have won several different designs since the practice began in 2012, and very few of them still retain any of their original yellow shade. Many people dream of one day being rich enough to own a private plane. So for someone to abandon one isn't just careless, it's rude. Nevertheless, here's a forgotten twin turboprop Grumman G159 that's been half hidden by foliage in Cartersville, Georgia, USA for almost 20 years. It's thought that when it was first parked up, it still had its instrument panels and equipment, but over time, anything valuable has been stripped away by thieves. Even the wings have been cut off and taken away. Now it's become a popular spot to hike to, and many of the hikers like to leave their own graffiti tags on what remains of the plane's body. Records show that its registration number, N173PA, was officially canceled in January 2005. But the aircraft had already been here for at least 2 years by that point. It was once the property of Phoenix Air, but they'd sold it into private hands long before it was abandoned. It's unknown why or how it came to be ditched like this. There are 2 different names for our next abandoned vehicle, which you'll find in Portland, Oregon, USA. One is the Collins Beach UFO Boat, and the other is the more euphemistic Savi Saucer. In either case, you can see how it got its name. It looks like a crashed alien spaceship, and the sinister-looking cat graffiti that now adorns its exterior only serves to add to its sense of otherworldliness. The story behind it is no less strange. It was built in the 1970s by a man named Richard Ensign, who was convinced that the end of the world was coming and that people would need houseboats to escape the total collapse of society. For 3 months, he and his family lived inside the 30-foot-long vessel, which was designed to be self-righting and contained comparatively luxurious facilities like a kitchen and central heating. When the apocalypse failed to materialize, he sold the boat, and in 1996, it was carried away by a flood that struck the Willamette River. That's where it is now, and where it will remain until it ultimately falls to pieces. The First World War was costly for every nation involved in the conflict and resulted in the loss of millions of dollars worth of expensive military equipment and vessels. Some of the shells of those vessels are still visible today, including this German U-boat on the coast of Kent in England. Although U-boats are usually associated with the Second World War, they were also used in the first one, where they were considered to be the most high-tech naval vessels of their era. This one was registered as the UB-122 and has spent the past century embedded in mudflats. They've helped to preserve it, and when the tide goes out, you can see that much of it is still in one piece. The U-boat was officially handed over to Britain after Germany surrendered, but it ran aground as it was being towed up the River Medway and couldn't be freed. UB-111 vessels like this were a massive problem for Allied forces during the war, so it's strange to see one turn into nothing more than a rusty curiosity. Everybody who ever met J. Dennis McGuire of Alma, Michigan, USA, knew that he was a car enthusiast and had a particular affinity for old Buicks. Nobody knew quite how deep that affinity ran until he built the Shamrockaway, a self-built motorhome that contains the remains of 4 different old Buicks and looks like no other vehicle we've ever seen. McGuire built the car for himself and his family in 1962 and enjoyed it for many years. It's 30 feet long from one end to the other, stands over 6 feet tall, and even has a bathroom inside it. The central part of the car is a Buick wagon with another Buick wagon split in half and attached to the other end, and yet another Buick body on top. Sadly, McGuire passed away in 1990, and the car became abandoned. Given that he's the only person who understood what it was made of or how it worked, it's doubtful it could be restored. But we'd like to see someone at least give it a try. We've seen train and tank cemeteries so far in this video, so now here's a boat cemetery to go with them. This is the Mezirbe Boat Cemetery of Latvia, where old wooden fishing vehicles come to rot away and return to nature. There were once many places like this across the Baltic coast, but the majority of them have long since been built over or disappeared. This is the only one left in Latvia, and it might even be the only one left in the world. Most of these broken down ships and boats have been here since the 1960s. Some of them are indistinguishable from the woodland that surrounds them. Nature has grown through and around them to such an extent that they appear to be one and the same thing. To be fair to the people who designed the cemetery, though, that was the whole point. Rather than ditching these boats or setting them on fire, they decided the wood belongs with the other wood, so this is as natural a demise as any retired boat could hope to meet with. One day, the boats will rot away completely, and there will be little sign that they were ever here at all. Rotting away peacefully and returning to nature isn't an option for the Kodiak Queen, which is stuck in the British Virgin Islands and made of materials that aren't biodegradable. You'd never know from looking at it, but this ship is significant in terms of American military history. It used to be a U.S. Navy fuel barge, YO-44, and it was one of only 5 vessels to escape from the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. After the war, it became a fishing trawler and sailed on for several decades, but after its abandonment, it seemed that it was destined to be scrapped. Instead, British artist Owen Buggy decided to turn it into an artificial reef, complete with an effigy of a sea monster that appeared to be surrounding and attacking the old vessel. Unfortunately, it was damaged during a huge storm that swept the area in 2017, and now it's half sunken with the shape of the sea monster broken and distorted. That's probably put the idea of scrapping it back on the agenda, but for now, it's still there. Don't be fooled by this tourist attraction on Prince Edward Island in Canada. Although your eyes might tell you that it's a U.S. space shuttle, it's not. It's an extremely convincing replica, and drawing attention from tourists is the whole reason it was built. As one of 6 replica space shuttles that were ever granted permission to be built, it used to be a part of the island's Science Adventure Park. Both the shuttle and the park it existed within entertained visitors for more than 2 decades, but financial hardship caused the park's closure in 2008. Everything else of value was shut down and taken away, but for some reason, the shuttle replica was left. Without the park there to explain its existence, people who still come across it by chance are left wondering if it became stranded there after touching down from orbit. Even if it isn't technically real, a replica this detailed ought to have some kind of value, so it's a mystery that another museum hasn't paid to acquire it and have it shipped to them. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.